Well, good morning and welcome to session number 5 of Exploring LDS History, where we are trying, to the best of my ability in this class, to take an honest look at the history of the LDS Church in a way that is truthful, but also in a way that is loving and in a way that is respectful. And if you are LDS here this morning, or you're LDS and you're watching this online later, we want you to know that we love you. And our intention in this class is not to try to be controversial. Our intention is not to be even argumentative. We just simply want to get at what is true. And Pastor Dan made a great statement in his message this morning that truth is true even when it hurts us. And that's true for all of us. Maybe my favorite definition, I think, of truth, when you say, what is truth? The truth is that which corresponds to reality. And we just want to know in this class, what does the truth say about the history and the founding of the LDS Church? And I'm doing my best in this class to follow the guidance of Scripture and do so in a way, in talking about difficult subjects, that is gracious and loving and kind. Even though we may disagree greatly on these, our intention for all of us, not just on this subject, but on any subject, we should all just want to know in the end, what's the truth here? Even if that truth is painful for me when I realize that it's true. And so hopefully, with God's guidance, we'll be able to do that this morning. So if you've been here in recent weeks, the last week we're looking at this time period between 1820 and 1827, where Joseph Smith had his first vision in 1820, and we've looked at that, and the second vision in 1823, and subsequent visions from Moroni every year after that. What's going on in his life between this period of 1820 and 1827 when he began to translate the Book of Mormon? We're going to look at that same time period from another different angle this morning, in examining how did Masonry affect the Book of Mormon. And in several ways we'll look at today. I think we'll specifically see where early 19th century Masonry had an influence on the Book of Mormon. So just to kind of set the table a little bit, most everybody's probably familiar with the Freemasons. They're still around today. Although they are struggling, from what I can glean online, they're struggling to hold on. They're losing numbers and they're losing membership. And they're trying to figure out how to keep their membership numbers up. But Masons are still around today. But they go all the way back to medieval Europe. And I think most people are familiar. You know, the Masons, they meet in their lodges. The different degrees of Masonry. You know, secret handshakes, secret oaths, special clothing they wear in their ceremonies there. All of those kinds of things. But the big thing, and especially in the early 19th century, in the 1800s, where we're talking about today, there's one Mason who famously said, the key thing of being a Mason is being able to keep a secret. Can you keep a secret or not? And so they take very serious oaths about the things that they do in the lodge. And then, we're most familiar with them today, that they do a lot of community work and charity work and are involved in a lot of different causes. But the Masons' popularity peaked in our country between 1790 and 1826. A lot of our founding fathers were famously Freemasons. George Washington, Benjamin Franklin, I believe, if I remember correctly, 14 signers of the Constitution were active Masons, all the way through in our time period that we're going to look at today. Andrew Jackson was a Mason. Henry Clay was a Mason. So their peak in America is in this period that we're talking about today. But I want to tell you a story, and here's how it all fits in. In 1826, a man named Captain William Morgan moved to Canandaigua, New York. Captain Morgan was a veteran of the War of 1812, and he kind of kept the moniker Captain afterwards. He moved to Canandaigua, New York, which, as you can see, according to Google Maps, is only 13.7 miles from Palmyra, New York, right where Joseph Smith and his family lived at the time. So all of this that we're going to talk about goes down in Joseph Smith's neck of the woods. In 1826, Captain Morgan moved to Canandaigua, and he had been a Mason for 30 years. And I don't know all of the details, but in trying to join the local Masonic lodge there in Canandaigua, they ran into some kind of difficulties and problems and disagreements and ended up having a falling out. And as a result of that falling out, he wrote a book where he threatened to expose all of the rituals of the Masons. I'm gonna write a tell-all, and I'm gonna publish this book because he was mad. That didn't go over particularly well with the Masons. And that led to what is today famously called the Morgan Affair, which you may or may not have heard of before. But immediately after he began to make these threats to publish this book, he began to have reprisal from, allegedly from the Masons. Like, for instance, there was a fire at the publisher's printing office. This very suspicious fire just happened to break out at the printing press. He was arrested once on different charges from these charges, and he got out of that one. Then he was arrested again for failure to pay a debt. And that debt actually was, he had a couple years prior, one of his kids had been born, and he was away at the time. And he wanted to go see his wife and son, but he didn't feel like he had appropriate clothes, so he borrowed a set of clothes from a friend so he could be dressed appropriately to go meet his new son, and he failed to ever give those back. So 2 years later, somebody got his friend to press charges. And so he was arrested for, I don't know, a few dollars worth of clothes, whatever it was. He was arrested and imprisoned for that, and you know, the laws of the day, he couldn't be released until he paid that debt. Then on September 1826, while he was in jail, a couple men showed up at the jail saying they had paid his debt. He was taken away from the jailhouse in a carriage, and he vanishes from history at that point, and he was never seen again. And the press of the day got onto the story, and it became an 1826 media sensation. A lot of historians would say this is the single most famous murder in the entire first half of the 19th century. If they had had CNN and Fox News and all the media outlets, you know, today the press will get a hold of a story and everybody's talking about the same thing. This story was kind of the same, except it was the newspapers. And it wasn't just covered locally there, it got nationwide coverage all over. And, you know, big story. He mysteriously goes missing. They never found a body. There was a few. Everybody assumed the Masons had done it, but there was no proof that the Masons had done it. And there was one story that said, you know, the most plausible story is that they took his body and they threw it in the Niagara River and it was never found. There was a body that washed up on the shore of Lake Ontario about a month later. They thought might have been his, but another lady claimed it. She's like, nope, that's my husband who was missing, and those are the clothes he was wearing. And so his body was never found. There were a handful of Masons that were brought to trial, but there was no body and not a ton of evidence, and so they were acquitted. And so caused this great big huge media stink, and I mean huge media story at the time. In the middle of all of that, David Miller, Morgan's publisher, decided to go ahead and publish the book. And here is a copy of that book. He went ahead and published it, and because of all of the attention it had been getting in the press, that book became an instant bestseller, and it was flying off of the shelves. And so all of that to say, all of the notoriety of this one story led to a massive anti-Masonic movement. Not just there in upstate New York, but all over the country. Churches begin to speak out against the Masons, and kind of like now, you know, one cause becomes the cause, or becomes the thing, right? And so all of a sudden, it hadn't been a big issue in churches with church members being Masons, but all of a sudden it became a huge issue in churches. And pastors are speaking out against the Masons and due to all of their, you know, secret practices. And so as a result of all of that, the Masons began to bleed in terms of their membership. It actually led the anti-Masonic movement. The anti-Masonic political party was formed. And this is interesting. This is the first third-party political movement in American history. And it gained enough steam that they actually had their own convention. And to nominate somebody for president, they actually ran candidates in the 1828 and the 1832 presidential election. So all that's to say, this anti-Masonic movement was big. And it was really big in upstate New York and in New England, and nearly caused the death of the Masons in America because they lost so many members during this time period. One good example in New York, where Joseph Smith was, in the mid-1820s, when all of this started, there were 500 Masonic lodges in New York. By 1837, there were only 26 that remained. So all of this to say, there was massive anti-Masonic sentiment in this time period, starting in 1826 when Captain Morgan went missing, on into 1827 and the founding of the anti-Masonic movement and party. And what's going on in Joseph Smith's life in that same time period? 1827, 28 into 29 is when he is translating the Book of Mormon. At the same time, all of this anti-Masonic stuff is going on. So here's how this entire Morgan affair plays into our story today. Let me give you just these couple examples of some of that sentiment. Here's the Palmyra Freeman. This is a newspaper in Joseph Smith's town, December 2nd, 1828. They read an article that said, "Our government and country will be destroyed unless the people put down Masonry, root and branch. And what will the people of this country think of themselves 10 or 20 years hence if they should suffer themselves to be duped and do not now unite hand and heart to put down a secret society which, if again suffered to get fairly the ascendancy, will crush them and their liberties altogether." So that's the kind of thought going around about the Masons at the time. They have to be stopped at all costs. They're going to ruin our country. We hear that same kind of political rhetoric today on issues, don't we? Another article from November 10th in 1829 said, "Masonry, thank God, is now before the world in all her naked deformity, a secret combination to destroy liberty and religion." And I want you to notice that phrase, secret combination. In this time period, that phrase, in the early 1800s, secret combination, was used almost exclusively in reference to Masons. And I would say, I say almost, just to leave it out in case there might be a reference or two to it being used in some other context. But there are some scholars who would say there are none. That every time in this time period you see the phrase secret combination in print, it's always in reference to the Masons. But whatever the case, it's certainly true that it was almost used entirely in referring to the Masons, and that's what got people freaked out, right? What are they doing in there in their lodges with all these secret practices and handshakes and, what's going on? They're dangerous, and, the Illuminati and, whatever kind of conspiracy theories that we have today. That same kind of hysteria about the Masons then. But this phrase, secret combination, was just used reference to the Masons. Remember, this is the same time period Joseph Smith's translating the Book of Mormon. Here's where it gets really interesting. The Book of Mormon was published in 1830, and the term secret combination is used 17 times in the Book of Mormon to refer to the practices of people supposedly in 300 AD, 1,500 years prior. So when you read the Book of Mormon, it seems to condemn Freemasonry. Here's one example of the same term from Alma 37:30. It says, "Thus the judgments of God did come upon these workers of darkness and their secret combinations." Most of these references in the Book of Mormon come from, and we're going to talk starting next week about the actual process of how we got the Book of Mormon and the story of the Book of Mormon. But there's a group of people in the Book of Mormon called the Gadianton Robbers. And they're a band of robbers that are founded by a man named Gadianton. And he was a wicked Nephite and refused to follow the Lord. And he practiced these secret combinations. And he had this organization that was based on secrecy and satanic oaths. And it's a big storyline in the Book of Mormon because he eventually leads a bunch of Nephites away from the Lord, and it ultimately leads to the destruction of the Nephite nation. And also in another place in the Book of Mormon, so the Book of Mormon chronicles the Jaredite nation as well, which is a separate storyline from the storyline of the Nephites and the Lamanites. But this practice of secret combinations is also what led to the destruction of the Jaredite nation. And so both of these civilizations, it's this practice of these secret combinations that leads to their ultimate downfall. So here's some of those references from the Book of Mormon. It says, at this time period there was continual peace in the land, all save it were the secret combinations which Gadianton the robber had established in the more settled parts of the land, which at that time were not known unto those who were at the head of government, therefore they were not destroyed out of the land. So it's in a time period, the people in charge of the Nephites, they're following God, they're obeying him, except for this band of Gadianton, and the only reason they didn't do something about him is it's that the leaders weren't aware that he's practicing these secret combinations. Helaman later says, but behold, Satan did stir up the hearts of the more part of the Nephites, insomuch that they did unite with those bands of robbers, talking about the Gadianton robbers. The other Nephites began to join with them, and they did enter into their covenants and their oaths. And it came to pass that they did have their signs, yea, their secret signs, and their secret words. Now behold, those secret oaths and covenants were put into the heart of Gadianton by that same being who did entice our first parents to partake of the forbidden fruit. So it would seem that these groups in the Book of Mormon, they're involved in some sort of ancient practice very similar to what, at the very least, right? They're doing something very similar to what the Masons were doing in Joseph Smith's day. Or could it be that Joseph Smith was just using the issues of his day in writing the Book of Mormon story? And it seems to me this is where you run into a problem in LDS theology, either which way you go. Because the Book of Mormon condemns very clearly in those passages we just read secret rites and oaths and secret combinations. It very clearly condemns them. And then about 12 years later, Joseph Smith is going to institute them in the temple himself. And a very big part of LDS practice, even till today, is their practice of secret combinations and secret oaths, and everything that you take in the temple is part of the endowment ceremony. So either way you go, you end up with a problem here. Either the Book of Mormon is describing an actual practice that took place in America in 300 AD that was something similar to what the Masons were practicing in 1826. And then Joseph Smith violates the Book of Mormon when he institutes those same kind of practices himself. Or, and this is what I think is the case, this is just an instance of Joseph Smith inserting his own sentiments into the Book of Mormon story. This was a big, huge issue at the time that he obviously would have been aware of, and he just uses that issue. You know, he's condemning Masonry in the story of the Book of Mormon because there was this massive anti-Masonic sentiment at the time. That seems to me to be the case if you just look at the evidence at the surface level. We'll talk in a little bit about how the church would respond to this largely today. But that's not the only place we see Masonry popping up in LDS thought. There's a lot of influence of Masonry in the LDS in their endowment ceremony. So we've looked at kind of Joseph Smith's views in 1827, ish, right? That's when all the anti-Masonic sentiment was going on, and that seems to be reflected in the Book of Mormon. We're going to fast forward now 12 years, so we're going to jump forward in time to 1841. In 1841, the church had moved to Nauvoo, Illinois. There was a point in time Nauvoo, Illinois was the second largest city in Illinois at the time, second only to Chicago. All of the saints were moving there. Joseph Smith had the charter for the town. He was the head of the city council for the town. It was his town. And in 1841, 18 Mormons organized the Masonic Lodge in Nauvoo, which you can see a picture there of it then, and it's still standing today. Then in March of 1842, the Masonic Grand Master for that area initiated Joseph Smith and Signe Rigdon to the degree of entered apprentice, so the entry level for Masons. And then the very next day, he gave them fellowcraft, the next level, and raised them to Master Mason. So it didn't take Joseph Smith long to get to the top. You got entered one day, the next day, he made Master Mason. So he escalated, he got to the top quickly to the master level, him and Rigdon both. But here's where it gets interesting. That was March 15th. On May 3rd, so less than 2 months later, Smith initiated the endowments in the newly completed temple in Nauvoo. So less than 2 months later, and depending on some who you read, 2 weeks later, he began working on what would become the LDS endowment ceremonies. Okay, so you with me? So Joseph Smith becomes a Mason. 2 months later, the endowments are begun for the very first time in the temple. Well, this is fascinating. Before we get to what happens, let's talk about the endowments for just a minute. And I don't want to be disparaging this morning. And I know this practice is very important for anybody who's a member of the LDS Church. But I do want to look honestly at how it came about. Here's what the church says today. This is from the church's webpage about the endowment ceremony. That only in the temple can we receive the ordinances needed to be exalted in the celestial kingdom, temple ordinances that include the endowment. Receiving your temple endowments can be one of the most sacred events of your life. It's important to know that your endowment is more than just another step. It's an essential and glorious part of your eternal journey. Receiving your temple endowment can be one of the most sacred events of your life. The word endowment means a gift, and in this context, the temple endowment is a gift or sacred blessing from God to each of us. The endowment can only be received in His way and in His holy temple. So endowments continue to be a very important part of LDS theology and LDS culture, even till today. But they have evolved quite a bit from what they were in 1842, when Joseph Smith first began the endowment. We're going to reach back in time to this morning to look back at what they were at the initial founding of the church. So before we get there, I want to compare Masonic practices at the time with Mormon temple practices at the time. So if you notice the reference here on this slide, this is the oath taken for the first degree or the apprentice degree of Masonry. This comes from William Morgan's book. So the book that he threatened to publish that might have got him killed, and it was published after his death. This comes from his tell-all, where he was saying, this is what Masons practice. And he said, that apprentice level, this is the oath they take. I will never reveal any part or parts, art or arts, point or points of the secret arts and mysteries of ancient Freemasonry, binding myself under no less penalty than to have my throat cut across, my tongue torn out by its roots. The sign accompanying this oath was to draw your right hand across your throat with the thumb next to your throat, with your arm as high as the elbow in a horizontal position. So, a slashing the throat movement. These are the temple endowments that Joseph Smith instituted 2 months later. So for the Aaronic priesthood, the oath was, we and each of us covenant and promise that we will not reveal any of the secrets of this, the first token of the Aaronic priesthood, with its accompanying name, sign, or penalty. Should we do so, we agree that our throats be cut from ear to ear and our tongues torn out by their roots. The sign, in executing of the penalty, the right hand palm down is drawn sharply across the throat and then dropped to the side. All right? You don't have to be a scholar to see that's virtually identical, isn't it? And this was the endowment ceremony at least up until the early 1900s. This first came out in an article in the Salt Lake Tribune in 1904, where the temple endowments were kind of exposed to the world. And they have changed over the course of the years a great deal. It's interesting, though, that even the oaths that were taken changed much earlier. The signs didn't until it's either 1990 or 1994. I can't remember at the moment. The oath changed, but they would still make the same throat-slitting gesture to accompany it. All right, the second degree of Masonry, here's the oath. Under no less penalty than to have my left breast torn open, and my heart and vitals taken from thence and thrown over my left shoulder and carried out into the valley of Jehoshaphat, there to become a prey to the wild beast of the field. And the sign accompanying that oath was drawing your right hand flat with it next to your breast, across your breast from left to right with some quickness. I'm going to have my insides torn out. The second degree, or token, of the Aaronic priesthood in the Mormon endowment ceremony was, we will not reveal the secrets of this, the second token of the Aaronic priesthood, and should we do so, we agree to have our breasts cut open and our hearts and vitals torn from our bodies and given to the birds of the air and the beast of the field. And the sign, placing the right hand across the chest with the thumb extended and then drawing rapidly from left to right. So again, you can see it's virtually identical, right? Then the oath to become a master mason. The oath was, we will not reveal the lodge's secrets under no less penalty than to have my body severed in two in the midst and divided to the north and south, my bowels burnt to ashes in the center. And the sign is putting the right hand to the left side of the bowels, the hand open with the thumb next to the belly, and draw it across the belly. The oath taken along with Melchizedek priesthood in the temple initially said, we agree that our bodies be cut asunder in the midst and all of our bowels gush out. The hands are dropped till the thumbs are in the center of the stomach and drawn swiftly across the stomach to the hips. So again, you can see these are all virtually identical. And that's easy to see, right? And that's what led Reed Durham, who we talked about briefly last week, was an LDS historian who gave a speech to the Mormon History Society in 1974 entitled, Is There No Hope for the Widow's Son? He said as part of that speech, speaking of the endowment, the similarities between the two ceremonies are so apparent and overwhelming that some dependent relationship cannot be denied. They are so similar, in fact, that one writer was led to refer to the endowment as celestial masonry. And I saw one quote this week in studying this where one of Brigham Young's wives said that he commonly referred to the endowment as celestial masonry. He went on to say, the many parallels found between early Mormonism and the masonry of that day are substantial. I believe there are few significant developments in the church after March 15th, 1842, when Smith became a Mason, which didn't have some Masonic interdependence. And here's a guy, who's a faithful Mormon, as far as I'm aware, to this day. I believe Reed Durham's still alive. I think he's in his 90s. He took a lot of flack for this after he made this speech in 1974. But he stayed a faithful member of the church. He hasn't retracted anything that he said. He did have to do a follow-up later, a letter that he circulated saying, hey, you know, I have a testimony. I believe in Joseph Smith, but we have to decide what we're going to do. with this because you can't deny the links between the two. Which led me to I wonder what early Mormon leaders had to say. Because when Joseph Smith initiated the endowments, almost all of his key men at the time were Masons. Right? They would have obviously been able to see the similarities between the two. So what did they say? What did early Mormon leaders say at the time about these similarities? And it's kind of interesting. One early leader named Joseph Fielding, who was a close personal friend of Joseph Smith, he recorded this in his journal, that many have joined the Masonic institution, and this seems to have been a stepping stone or a preparation for something else, the true origin of Masonry. And that's kind of going to be the party line, is we've got back to the truth of what Masonry was intended to be. Another early leader, Benjamin Johnson, who was a private secretary to Joseph Smith, so he had a very close working relationship with him. He said, Joseph Smith told me Freemasonry at present was the apostate endowments, just as sectarian religion was the apostate religion. So just like God the Father told Joseph Smith, all of the denominations are an abomination, don't join them, you're going to restore the church back to the truth, that the party line is going to be Masonry. It had some truth in there, but it's become corrupt and it's become false. And so now we're going to restore true Masonry back to its intended form. Heber Kimball, who was the lieutenant governor of Utah Territory at one point and the first counselor to Brigham Young when he was the president of the church, he taught this same thing, that Masonry had been corrupted and we just got the real thing. Here's what he said. We have the true Masonry. The Masonry of today is received from the apostasy which took place back in the days of Solomon and David. And so there's a lot of legends in Masonry that go back to Solomon's temple, right? And underneath Solomon's temple, there was this room with these secret records and all of these Masonic legends. And he was going, back in David and Solomon's day, they had the true Masonry, and it's been corrupted and apostatized since then, but we have the real thing. Thomas Sandhouse said this was the common viewpoint from 1842 to 73. They always asserted that Freemasonry was a degenerate representation of the order of true Masonry. So there's some roots of things there in Masons, and Joseph Smith just restored it back to the truth. What do church leaders say about it today? And I took this directly from the church's website, where they do have to acknowledge there is a link between, you can't ignore the link between Masonry and the endowments and Joseph Smith in this time period. So you have to make all this work together somehow. And so this is what it says on the church website today. Joseph and his associates understood that Masonry as an institution that had preserved vestiges of ancient truth. So same line, right? There were some vestiges of truth in there, and Joseph realized that when he became a Mormon. And they acknowledged parallels between Masonic rituals and the endowment, but concluded, based on their experience with both, that the ordinance was divinely restored. So there was vestiges there, but God used Smith to restore it to what it was intended to be. They continue, during temple ordinances, men and women covenant with God to obey His laws for the purpose of gaining exaltation through the atonement of Jesus Christ. Masonic rituals deliver stage-by-stage instruction using dramatization and symbolic gestures and clothing with content based on Masonic legends. The endowment employs similar teaching devices. So they acknowledge in the temple they use dramatizations, they use symbolic gestures, they use special clothing, all of these same things that the Masons use. But the difference is we draw primarily upon revelations and inspired translations given to Joseph Smith for its content. So the thought would be that Joseph Smith, he realized the roots of the Masonic stuff that was legit in there, but the contents of our endowment are different because God gave him revelation to what it should be. The same as with the church. The church had become apostate. God revealed to Joseph Smith what it should be. Masonry had become apostatized, and God revealed to Joseph Smith, and he restored it to its true form. They continue. The ideas and institutions in the culture that surrounded Joseph Smith frequently contributed to the process by which he obtained revelation. This is the interesting part to me, and again, this is from the church website, and they use this same kind of thought over and over again, right? Yes, Joseph Smith was a money digger, and yes, he had a seer stone, but that God used that as part of the revelation process for Joseph Smith. And yes, he was a mason, and he did become a master mason, but God used that masonry and his knowledge there too in revealing the truth to Joseph Smith. So all of these things were just a catalyst that God used these things to reveal to him, like the seer stone and like masonry. God just used those things as a vehicle for revealing the truth to Joseph Smith. All right, we'll come back to that in a minute. And this doesn't prove anything one way or the other than I find this fascinating. The story surrounding the death of Joseph Smith. And so we're going to fast forward again, and we'll look at this in much more detail later. But for now, just to see the tie-in with Masonry, in 1844, Joseph and his brother Hiram and a couple other Mormon leaders were incarcerated in the jail in Carthage, Illinois, on charges of treason against the state of Illinois. And we'll get to why that was later. But for our purposes this morning, on June 24th, a mob of about 200 men stormed the jail, and in that process, Joseph and his brother Hiram were both killed. Joseph Smith was shot twice in the back when they came into the room as he was trying to jump out of a window, and he was shot twice in the back, and then he fell to the ground. The interesting thing is that according to the eyewitness accounts of John Taylor and Willard Richards, who were two, I believe they were both apostles, but they were two of the Mormon leaders in jail with Hiram and Joseph, and they both survived the shooting. One of them was shot several times himself, but they both survived, and they both agree in their testimony that Joseph Smith's final words were, "O Lord, my God," which sounds like maybe he's beginning to pray or something, but his last words were, "O Lord, my God." This is how it's recorded in the history of the church, in the LDS official history of the church. It says that Joseph, seeing there was no safety in the room, and no doubt thinking that it would save the lives of his brethren in the room if he could get out, turned calmly from the door, dropped his pistol on the floor, he had emptied it, and sprang into the window, when two balls pierced him from the door, and one entered his right breast from without, and he fell outward into the hands of his murderers, exclaiming, "O Lord, my God." The first-hand testimony from John Taylor, which is included in the Doctrine and Covenants. John Taylor said, Hiram was shot first and fell calmly, exclaiming, "I am a dead man." And Joseph leaped from the window and was shot dead in the attempt, exclaiming, "O Lord, my God." They were both shot after they were dead in a brutal manner, and both received 4 balls. And they were both shot 4 times in total. Willard Richards' account says 2 balls pierced Joseph from the door, and the one entered his right breast from without, and he fell outward, exclaiming, "O Lord, my God." And as his feet went out the window, my head went in. So he said, I was right behind him, right? And as his feet went out the window, my head went in, the balls whistling all around, and he fell on his left side, a dead man. So all the accounts agree Joseph Smith's last words were, "O Lord, my God." Here's where it gets interesting. Those who knew Joseph Smith at the time believed that his saying that was an attempt to save his life by calling out to the Freemasons in the mob to save him. Among the brotherhood of the Freemasons, at least at the time, there was the grand hailing sign of distress, which is, "O Lord, my God, is there no help for the widow's son?" Which is where Reed Durham got the title for the speech he made in 1974. And according to Masonic code, if any Mason hears another Mason utter that grand hailing sign, you are required to come to their aid and help him. So the thought of some is that that's what Joseph Smith was trying to get out. Oh, Lord, my God, and he got shot twice. That's all he ever was able to get out. But he was trying to make this distress call to, there was a lot of Masons in that mob that day, in order to save himself and save his friends, to get them to help him, or at least to call off the attack. I'm not 100% convinced that's the case, but I find that very, very interesting. That maybe even in those last moments, that was some of the things going on in Joseph Smith's mind. All right. That was a lot, but here's the question we have to answer. Just looking at the evidence that history provides us, which seems more likely? That Joseph Smith miraculously translated the golden plates of the Book of Mormon, which just happened to include accounts of an ancient form of Masonry or something similar to Masonry occurring 1,000 years before Masonry ever existed, even in Europe. And it's just a coincidence that there was a heated societal debate about secret combinations at the exact same time that Smith was doing this translating. Is it more reasonable to believe that Joseph Smith was all of these influences, using seer stones and joining the Masons and all of this stuff, that was just part of the revelatory process that God used for Joseph Smith to restore the church? And the similarities between Masonry and the endowments are just the result of that revelatory process where Smith corrected practices of ceremonies that had been bastardized by the Masons, and he just restored them back to their true form. That's the account you have to take, it seems to me, if you believe the LDS account of things, or if you want to hold Joseph Smith as a prophet who restored the church. You have to take some sort of line similar to that to make all of the pieces fit together. Because you have to acknowledge he was using seer stones. You have to acknowledge he was very involved in Masonry. You have to acknowledge that he obviously borrowed a great deal from Masonry in setting up the temple endowments. And that it's just a coincidence, any similarities in the Book of Mormon. And God just used these things as part of the process of guiding Joseph Smith in revealing the truth to him. You have to believe some version of that. Or does it seem more likely? And remember, the truth is true even if it's painful to us. Truth is true even if it's hard truth. Does it seem more likely that the Book of Mormon is a product of the early 18th century, and that as a result, it reflects Joseph Smith's views on Masonry at the time that it was composed in the late 1820s? And that the change in Smith's views from the late 1820s to the early 1840s is best explained by his own evolving theology over the course of time. Because you still have the tricky problem to deal with that in 1828, the Book of Mormon appears to be very anti-Masonic. At the very least, it condemns any kind of practice of secret combinations and secret oaths and secret rituals. And 12 years later, the church established secret combinations and secret oaths and secret rituals. And so there's conflict there. If the Book of Mormon is divinely inspired and it is Scripture, then how can they be violating their own Scriptures when they set up the endowment 12 years later? Or does it make more sense that in the late 1820s, Smith was caught up in all of this anti-Masonic sentiment going on at the time, and that's reflected in the composition of the Book of Mormon, and all that had died down by 1842, and he joined the Masons, and that influenced him in his theology later. Is it more likely that God used the LDS or the Masonic practices to reveal the truth to Smith? Or is it more likely that he borrowed heavily in coming up with the endowment ceremony? And that there was no revelatory aspect to either the creation of the Book of Mormon or the temple endowment ceremonies. And these are things, again, that I say not wanting to beat anybody up and not wanting to be controversial, but these are issues that you have to wrestle with if you're here this morning or you're watching online and you're coming from the LDS perspective. These things, you have to acknowledge them and figure out how you're going to deal with them. And we would love to talk to you. I would love to talk to you if you're here this morning and you have questions. If you're watching online, we'd love to get together and discuss these things in a loving way with you, and we can disagree without being disagreeable, but we would like to walk through some of these issues with you. We're going to leave off there for today, and next week we will get specifically to what went on in that process from 1827 to late 1829 as Joseph Smith is translating the Book of Mormon itself, and we'll look at that process together and how the Book of Mormon came about. But thank you for being here today. Let me pray for you, and I'll let you go.